We as a world are in the midst of two viruses. One, the coronavirus pandemic, for which we are working so hard to contain its spread, ultimately seeking to eliminate it altogether. The second, the virus of racism, one that has permeated our culture here in the United States for 400 years. Pope Francis has called for Christians across the globe to be more deeply united as witnesses of mercy, asking the Spirit for the gift of unity. He last month said, "Only if we live as brothers and sisters can we spread the spirit of fraternity." Here in the Diocese of Springfield, a prayer service for racial unity was held Friday here in St. Michael's Cathedral, organized by Father Warren Savage, director and Catholic chaplain at the Interfaith Center at Westfield State University. Father Savage said the Spirit of God calls all to live in peace and unity with one another. And he said that the sin and evil of racism will never be eradicated until we examine the way we treat people. Earlier this week, I sat down with Sister of St. Joseph, Melinda Pellerin, pastoral minister at Holy Name Parish in Springfield. Sister Pellerin is a member of the board of directors of the National Black Sisters Conference and spends time speaking nationally on the need for dialogue and prayer to end racism. Pope Francis called on all of us globally to stand up to racial injustice. What does the church need to do to put an end to this?
Sharon, in part of that statement, he also said we can't turn a blind eye to racism, and I think globally we're bearing witness to a global community that is reacting to the death of an African American, and they're really making a stand for social justice. And I think that that's what we need to do. Unfortunately, I don't see that very much in the church in America among the bishops. Very few bishops have come out in talking about the death of George Floyd. Nationally, I see a resurgence of people that are protesting, but in this local community, Catholics, I don't see very many Catholics who are standing in outrage to what has happened. And I think following the Pope, we need to do more of that. Silence is not golden, it's deadly.
Mm-hmm. So what can we do?
Well, one of the things that we can do is in local churches and in our parishes, we can have prayer groups. Prayer is really important. The Pope talked about prayer. In fact, he mentioned that praying to Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Guadalupe, is the Blessed Mother of the Americas. That's one step. Another step I think that all the parishes should be doing is our priests are the leaders of the parishes. Why isn't it that on the pulpit priests are talking about this issue? I think programs like Just Faith are really good opportunities for people to learn about white privilege and how white privilege has caused many of the problems that we have in this nation. But I think you got to move from programs like Just Faith to protesting and to really doing what Jesus asks us to do. Jesus turned all the tables over in the temple, and that's a reaction, and it causes consequences. And Catholics have to know that if you take stands like this, you are in step with what Jesus teaches us, to love our neighbor, and when our neighbor is asking for our help, we must do that. We must help.
Mm-hmm. Commitment to the dear neighbor is the mission of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Springfield, a mission that Sister Melinda was drawn toward. She made her final vows, the first African American to join the Sisters of St. Joseph of Springfield, last October 13th during a liturgy at Holy Name Church in Springfield, the city of her birth. Now, tell me, you were born and raised in Springfield. Mm-hmm. What was that like for you as a young little black girl growing up in Springfield?
As an African American, it was really difficult because the street we lived on, Sycamore Street, most of the children and most of the families went to Black Baptist churches, and here's this one Pellerin family who every Sunday trotted off to Holy Family Catholic Church. So among other African American children, oh, you're going to that white church. And so I grew up in that. I grew up in a black neighborhood, but I went to white Catholic church and school. So it was very different from where my classmates came from. And racism existed there. I can remember at age 6, a little boy in Sister Richard Agnes's class looked at me and said, "Why are you so dirty?" I was the only black student in the class, and I remember literally going down to the bathroom and using soap and trying to wipe this off. When I got home and I explained it to my parents, so that was one of the talks that we had about the differences between me and the other children in class. In my 6-year-old self, I wondered, why did this little boy think I was dirty? So those were some of my first experiences with the difference between who I was and the other students in the class.
And your parents grew up in Louisiana.
Yes.
And they wanted you to they didn't have children when they moved up here, from what you were telling me, but they didn't want their children to have to experience that. But what were some of the things that they experienced growing up in Louisiana, and why did they move?
They grew up in Broussard, Louisiana. In fact, my parents grew up a house away from each other. My father was the only boy, and he had 4 sisters. My mother was the youngest and the only girl, and she had 4 brothers. They grew up in this system of segregation, so they knew what it was like. We constantly, my family, my cousins, my sisters and brothers and I heard stories about going to the white Catholic church in Broussard, Louisiana. The white congregation would sit up front, black congregation sat in the back. White Catholics got their communion first. Black Catholics got it after all. The white Catholics got communion. The white priest would put gloves on and give them their communion, Black Catholics. So my father always said, I don't want my children, if I marry this woman and we have children, I don't want them raised in the segregation of the South. And so my mother had been to Springfield a year prior to their marriage, and they decided to move to the state where the Kennedys had lived. My father always said that he wanted a chance for his children to have a better education.
This week, Friday, we're having a prayer service for unity. And what are your thoughts on that?
So I love the first song that we're doing for the prayer service, A Balm in Gilead. So the word balm is an ointment, and you spread an ointment to comfort. And so this song is actually a spiritual that black slaves sang on the plantation. So if you can imagine, these slaves' lives were horrific, but they still held on to hope, and that God would soothe all of their problems and all of the things that they were experiencing in slavery. So the song gives hope.
There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole.
There is always hope, says Sister Melinda. During the Friday 5 p.m. prayer service for unity, participants prayed for racial harmony and the need to put a balm on the sin of racism that the United States has dealt with for 400 years. The planned prayer service is one of many events throughout the state and the nation that have followed the May 25th death of George Floyd, a black man killed by a Minneapolis police officer who knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. Following Floyd's death, Apostolic Administrator Archbishop Mitchell Rosansky called for people of faith to pray for an end to this violence and the beginning of a meaningful effort to address the underlying currents of the racial divide.
But we cannot merely come here today and pray for that change and leave these 4 walls and go back to life as it is, accepting the status quo. We have to be converted, transformed.
The prayer service was organized by Father Warren Savage, Sister Melinda Pellerin, and Marian Johnson, Administrative Director of the Springfield Diocese Black Catholic Apostolate. Sister Melinda says, just like we are all dealing with COVID-19, so too is racism a virus.
So number one, it's a pandemic. It's just as bad and infectious as the pandemic we're talking about today. I often call it the pandemic of racism, that we have never found a cure for. We have never truly dealt with it. So number one, in order to get rid of a pandemic, you have to deal with it. You have to discuss those really difficult conversations about race and why that this has happened for 400 years. And then you have to act. You can't be about talk. You can't be about reading a good book on social injustice, racism. You've got to act. So you've got to be in the streets. You've got to peacefully demonstrate for the rights of African Americans and what's happening today. And when you act, know in the model of Jesus Christ that this is not going to be easy. Not any of it is easy. Martin Luther King, in his letter to Birmingham jail, said, racism is like a boil, and a boil is disgusting. It's got to be lanced. It's got to be taken care of. If you don't, the boil just gets bigger and bigger. And I think today we're seeing that happening. We've never dealt with it, and so we have to. And just like that, the COVID virus, we have to be dedicated to finding a cure for it.
Well, let's hope for that cure, that it comes very, very soon. And we thank you for talking to us, and we're praying for you.
Thank you.
And I would like to thank Sister Melinda Pellerin for her thoughtful insight and for sharing the stories of injustice her family has faced. Stories we hope will not be forgotten nor repeated.